Hey folks, David Parsons here. Just got a quick announcement before we start today's show. A lot of people ask me where I get my news, and I always have one answer. I get my news from the screenshots that Justin Rogers Cooper sends me by text message every morning and has been doing so for more than 10 years now. Those screenshots are excerpts from legacy media like the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, the New York Times, Washington Post, a million other publications. If you ask Noam Chomsky, that's where you find the truth, usually buried in the third or fourth paragraph. And all of those screenshots for me, what they do is they help me cut through the opinions that are running through social media that really distort what I'm supposed to think. And they get me to a sort of raw feed of what's happening. There's data, there's charts, there's quotes from major capitalists. I really get a feel of what's going on from these screenshots. I cannot tell you how valuable this service is. And a few of you have asked if there's any way for you to get in on those screenshots, and now there is. So I've set up a chat on the Patreon page available to people subscribing at the Culture Warrior level and above. You can check all that out at the link in the episode description. But I'm having fun already sharing Justin's screenshots with the Nostalgia Trap community. So if you want to check that out, check out the link and enjoy this episode. Here's me and Justin talking about Hunter S. Thompson. Well, okay, my friends, welcome to Nostalgia Trap. It's your friend David Parsons here with my good friend, and hopefully your friend too, Justin Rogers Cooper. Good to see you, Justin. How are you?
I'm good. Those are high hopes.
Happy Friday. We're all friends here. That's what podcasts are for. So this week, we want to talk about Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, the Hunter S. Thompson book and eventual film that came out in 1998. I want to start just by saying a little bit about why we're even doing this, because last time you and I talked, Justin, we did an episode about Jim Morrison and the Doors, and it brought up a lot about a theme that's come up a lot on Nostalgia Trap, which I think is a constant theme on this show. Honestly, if we went back many years, is this sort of idea that in the 1990s, when you and I were both sort of very, very young men, well, even kids really, when the 90s started, but it was a coming of age time for sure, the 90s. And that culture that we grew up in, particularly the kind of rock and roll counterculture, symbolized by Nirvana and so many other really big bands and movies and things like that, it was connected to the 60s. There was a weird sort of like 90s, 60s moment. And Hunter S. Thompson and Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, I think, was a part of that. I know when the movie came out in 1998, it was a big deal. And I don't know if this is true because it's been a long time, but I think the movie really kind of made me aware of who Hunter S. Thompson was, even. I didn't even really know that this was a person that I should pay attention to at all. And it felt like it was part of like, oh, okay, there's like a hip sort of thing going on here, and I should maybe pick up the book. And I'm not sure when I picked up the book, but I've read it several times. And in fact, in preparing for this episode, I found that I couldn't find my copy of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. And I'm glad that I got a chance to go out and replace it. I got this 50th anniversary version at the bookstore just a couple blocks from my house. They had this version, which is cool because it includes like some other stories and some other Hunter S. Thompson material. But either way, I'm glad to replace it because the copy I had was like the lame like movie copy with like Johnny Depp on the cover. But either way, where do we start with Hunter S? Because it's a heavy legacy and one that I think that I'm still wrestling with, honestly.
I think the reason why I never wanted to do a Thompson show up until now is because I had such grand designs for it because he's one of the authors that I've read or listened to, via audiobook, pretty much everything he's ever written. Like I've taken that time and I digested most of what he's ever written or listened to it. And I felt like, oh, it's going to have to be this epic fucking trilogy on him. And I think the only way to get in is to get in through a single text like Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. That one makes the most sense. And to sort of extrapolate a little bit about him and his life through the book, because the book to me is accessible in a way that maybe he's not. Like, even after reading all of his shit, he's still a mysterious guy to me. And I didn't read a biography of him. You know what I mean? So like
Yeah.
you got to come at him through the kind of the parallax view here. You know what I mean? Like you got to look at it from different angles. And there's a kind of, it's like, if we were going to do his whole life, that'd be almost like too much for one show. But thinking about this text, I think radiates something special and that hits on nostalgia trap in a couple different ways. One of them is the ways that you just described, like the 90s digesting the 60s, like the 90s as somehow like the children of the 60s boomers, you know what I mean? Like in a weird relationship. And part of the reason why that's important, and I think we've spoken to this at various other times, is because whatever nostalgia there is for the 90s, like now or in the last 10 years, that's kind of come and gone around things like Cobain's anniversary or the fashion trends, etc. Whatever's going on with the 90s is different than what's going on with the 60s. And like the kind of boomer nostalgia for the 60s that was able to like find its way into us, kind of like the youngest members of Gen X, if you will. That didn't replicate itself. Like if you go back to what you said about Occupy Wall Street, and was it Crosby who came trying to sing, and everyone was like, "Shut the fuck up!" Like there's something about the moment that Thompson's writing about in Fear and Loathing that made sense for us as teenagers, but never again. It washed out completely. So I think looking at it through that sort of lens is important. And then I think it's also important through like the kind of more obvious, like metaphoric analogy of the nostalgia trap, which is to say, what did the kind of end of the 60s mean to someone like Thompson, like at that moment he's writing, which in the narrative is 1971, Nixon's first term. Like what does it mean in the wake of that like post 68 depression that Baldwin also writes about in his book No Name in the Street? Like that's a sad fucking book. And this book and that book are almost coming out at the same moment. So what is that early 70s affect, that kind of depression, that feeling, that like hungoverness, even in this like zany, comical, psychedelic story? What does that still tell us about the rise and fall of that Doors moment we just talked about?
Yeah.
And then how do we like get at all of these layers in this discussion by like looking to some of the things that pop? And one of the things that I think is a through line that I thought of for today, and that's something that you might know more than me about, because you've done entire, I believe, trap episodes on the subject, is Vegas itself. And so I think one of the things to kind of think about here is it's not Fear and Loathing in Pittsburgh or LA or Greenwich Village or Chicago. It's Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. And the setting is so fucking key. And when you think about some of the reasons why this text, more than anything else Thompson wrote, and this might not even be some of the best things that he ever wrote, but why is this the most successful in terms of popular culture? Why did this have like an undue impact? One of the reasons is Vegas, and like Vegas is the through line. So he mentions that like Vegas is like stuck in the late 50s at one point during the end of the novel. But you could argue like even with the Disneyfication of Vegas in the 21st century, there's something about Vegas that's the through line, that's core.
Yeah.
And that's what makes this a lasting legacy text in ways that maybe his campaign coverage shit, which just doesn't hold up in terms of popular memory or popular understanding or the market today. That's one thing to think about. The other thing to think about this text, I'm just throwing these out, we can go deeper later or not, but the other big thing that's present here that I think accounts for its exceptionalism in Thompson's overall work is the presence of Dr. Gonzo, his attorney, Acosta, his friend. That character and that dialogue between the two accounts for some of the absolute funniest exchanges in the book. which might be called a novel or a memoir, like depending on how you look at it. But that text radiates in a way that some of his others just doesn't, in part because he has a foil. Like in this text, he often plays the straight man
Yes.
to Acosta's insanity,
Yep.
whereas in other like autobiographical accounts, he's not always the straight man, and it's the other character, the other figures in his texts who are the straight man, the foil to him. That's a completely different dynamic. And it's worth really thinking about what was captured here in terms of its market success, why this was made into a film, but some of his other writing was not, because this wasn't the thing that brought him to fame. And this wasn't the compendium of some of his really insightful and decisive political commentary. This was something else. And I think those two aspects, the Vegas and the Dr. Gonzo, begin to account for some of the variables that made this pop, if you will.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. And the Benicio del Toro plays Dr. Gonzo in the movie, and it's just an unbelievable performance. And you're right, it's often like him who has gone completely insane, and Hunter S sort of drawing that back. That like one toke over the
Yeah.
line, like
Which one
all
of you honkies wants to get cut?
yeah, all of that. Like just
Yeah.
he's great. And yeah, it's I mean part of it is the like just the wild drug stuff, I think that's part of it. And I mentioned to you that like there was, there was a whole kind of group of hipsters in the 90s who were sort of looking at Hunter S. Thompson as the model for like a new kind of gonzo journalism. I think Matt Taibbi of Rolling Stone, you remember that guy? I mean, he's a douchebag now, like basically a Trump guy, I think, close to it. But either way, he's sort of like self-consciously trying to be Hunter S. Thompson. That was the same with Vice magazine. They were trying to be that. And I thought, wow, like when I was young, I was like, oh, okay, the cool journalists, the cool writers are the ones that are all fucked up on drugs. And like the Doors were part of that mystique. We talked about that romance. But in terms of the Vegas stuff, yeah, I think that's key too. And I think about Vegas a lot. I'm obsessed with Vegas. I go there way too much and enjoy the Disney-fied Vegas. But I have to say, I have a nostalgia for the 90s Vegas. The movie Swingers that came out in like, I don't know, 96, I think. That movie, was part of a whole kind of West Coast obsession with Sinatra and the Rat Pack and the kind of romance of Vegas. There's a lot invested there. But if I'm trying to think about like what Hunter S. Thompson is keying into with Vegas, he mentions, and this is something that I think you would appreciate. He mentions Horatio Alger a lot. He's always like saying like that this is Vegas is the place where like the Horatio Alger myth sort of comes out in its most like raw form, right? That like I always loved and appreciated casinos. You and I have talked about Deadwood a lot. Deadwood is another maybe physical space where you can feel the kind of scam of capitalism and the opportunity in it too. You can like feel how dirty and shitty and cheap it all is, and yet that there's a freedom in that. Like being in a casino feels like there's some weird kind of, even though like the house always wins and everybody fucking knows it, that's part of what's freeing about it. We don't have to like pretend that it isn't a scam. We don't have to pretend that it isn't anything other than like a cheap parlor game. So that's freeing and let's just play it. That to me, there's something key in there. There's a freedom, in other words. And I think that's another key word with Hunter S. Thompson is like there's a libertarian streak to him. We can get into the political part of Thompson later maybe because he does have a politics and he does, I think fall on the left in a lot of different important ways. But he also has this sort of like, I'm a free dude that's like full of drugs. I got a gun in my pocket. There's something edgy and dangerous about Thompson, and I think that's kind of keyed into Vegas as well.
I think some of the danger and the edginess and arguably the self-destructiveness is something that immediately calls back to what we talked about in our last show with Morrison.
Yeah.
And I think that in some ways, the way that he was able to be in this novel and in the period in which he was most active, 60s and 70s, and maybe a little bit beyond there, was kind of a different moment. And I think it was a different moment for masculinity. I think it was a different moment for being a white male. I think it was a different legal moment. And it seems like, if we take some of the history at face value, it was a time when norms were breaking down and the laws just weren't being enforced. And so part of it's easy to say, like, when he is stopped by the Nevada highway patrol on his way that he thinks is leaving Nevada back to LA, and he takes the cop on a wild ride at 110 miles an hour with his blinker on. And he says that, only an idiot would pull over immediately. What you want to do is, show the officer a sign of respect by making him chase you. And when he finally gets pulled over, in the film, it's kind of clear that he's recognized. It's less so in the book. In the book, it seems like there's possibly something else going on there in addition to his fame or recognition being present. But it's easy to say he's let off in that situation because there's like this camaraderie between two white men, who are both in their 30s, by the way. He identifies the cop as, I think, early 30s, and he himself at this time was, well, when the book was published, I think, in his early to mid 30s or late 30s. But when this incident was taking place, I guess not that much younger, older. Anyway, the point that I'm making is it's easy to write that off as a time when white maleness had this libertarian advantage in situations like that, and to some extent, that's just true. I don't see how else you could argue that. Like, you could get if he had been a black male in the same situation, famous or not. I'm just not sure he gets out of that situation the way that he does in the text here, assuming it even happened. So again,
right. I
taking
forget
that
in
into
the
consideration.
in the book, does he have to kiss him? Because in the movie, he has to kiss the highway patrolman. The guy's
I
like,
don't I don't
I get
think
so
so.
lonely out here. Can I get a little kiss?
Yeah,
And
I don't.
and 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 Thompson's like, I felt raped. But
I
but
guess he does say he felt raped, so maybe that is in the book,
that's insane.
So
What an
okay, so that
exchange,
I guess
Jesus.
that adds another dimension that I'll skip over for a second. But I think the other side of that would just be that we were at a time when the norms were breaking down,
Right.
and so some of that is all kind of trying to put that under the ledger. When it comes to the Vegas part, just a couple notes there. One is, you know, to me, there's two things to kind of come at Vegas with on this particular note. One, the way you describe the casino just now, it almost sounds like you're describing being on the inside of like a crypto app. You know what I mean? Like, if you could fall into your phone, like Alice in Wonderland style, and like enter the app and try to get a sense of like what's at stake when the wheels are turning and the numbers are flowing and you're buying and selling and you're playing this game. The kind of gambling that takes place in these crypto and stock markets is not unrelated to the kind of sensations and in culture that you're describing inside the casino. And so there's a weird way that like the analog three-dimensional space of Vegas, and also like what it means,
And
is precisely the thing that's folded into our digital culture in the 21st century, if you
yeah,
will.
yeah. It gives the lie to the whole Horatio Alger thing. And if we're thinking of Horatio Alger's the idea that, if you work hard, you can be rewarded. Because I shared the screenshot on News Trapper earlier this week that you sent, where some guy, I think it was in the Financial Times, like he was saying like, why would I graduate like with a bunch of debt and work hard in school when like some douchebag is just going to make $1 billion like flipping crypto coin? Like, and it's sort of like the casino does the same thing. You're sort of like watching people just play a fucking stupid game on a table with like cards or a wheel of fortune and win. And it's sort of like, that's how you get wealthy too? You can just get wealthy through like cheap manipulation of a fucking game. It sort of like ruins the whole idea that working hard is the path to wealth in America.
Well, don't forget the central irony of those Horatio Alger narratives is that the hard work in those texts never produce wealth. The hard work among the youth signifies their virtue, and then an older wealthy patron, it rewards their virtue with a stipend, with a bequeath, with a gift, and it's the gift that makes them rich. So one of
Interesting.
the weird
So
things
it's like
about
it's almost like the belief is what gets you like the
yeah, in
reward,
other
not the
words, you have
actual
to
work itself.
yeah, you have to be an honorable soul in order to qualify for potential wealth, but
Wow.
the work doesn't actually deliver it to you. And the other irony of the Horatio Alger books too is that the way that the young character who becomes rich eventually or secure, the way that they stumble into the patron is always by luck. So one of the kind of key wheels of fortune in the Horatio Alger myth is exactly what you're describing as the Vegas sensation, and what Hunter Thompson is getting at here, which is that to really find kind of security in the American dream, it requires a great deal of luck. So let's just cut the work out of it and just go straight to the table, or to the app, as it were. So I
Yeah.
think that the kind of the Vegas analogy and its place in the American dream as like this complicating irony to that myth of hard work is really really important here, and it's one piece to the puzzle. The other side to Vegas, and this is the other little wing of it that I wanted to get at that maybe we can explore at some point, is he over and over says in the novel, and it's clear in the film too, that part of the reason why Circus and other like phantasmagoric sites around Vegas are so overwhelming to him and his attorney as they proceed with mescaline and acid, into those spaces, is because those sites were designed to overstimulate like the sober or drunk brain, and they are mimicking the psychedelic effects of the drugs themselves. So, in other words, one of the kind of lacerating analyses that Thompson poses about Vegas, and you can kind of extend the analysis from there, but one of the lacerating analyses that he poses about Vegas is that people, including straight people, normative people, the normies, cops, etc. People flock to Las Vegas in order to get those dopamine hits, to get that rush, to get that sensation, not just from the gambling, but from the environment, which is not also unlinked to sexual license and sexual markets. And so you're kind of heading into this real space. And you might be calling yourself an outstanding, sober, patriotic American, but really the thing that you're pursuing is not that far off from what the junkie is pursuing on the streets of New York and LA. And it's not that far off from what those hippies are doing at Haight Asbury at the intersection there, even while you would claim to be from a different world and a different culture.
Love it.
And
Yeah.
that starts to get at some of the reasons why, in Thompson's remarks here, we might imagine the 60s to fail, because in ways that we've spoken about before, but maybe in ways that are posed to us new, the kind of hippie movement and the kind of acid wave that was going on in California in the mid to late 60s and sort of representing that whole movement, maybe that counterculture wasn't that far off from the mainstream culture as we'd like to think, because the pursuit of pleasure, the pursuit of wealth, the pursuit of sensation, the pursuit of this shortcut to the American dream, even while people might differ about the values behind it or what the end goal was, a lot of those pursuits were parallel pursuits in ways that maybe both the hippies and the cops wouldn't have otherwise wanted to acknowledge.
Mm.
And so that's what makes Thompson crashing the narcotics conference so interesting and also ironic, is because he's clearly just another freak in the freak kingdom, counterposed to them. And at the same time, throughout the novel, he kind of describes many situations where even though where his badge will say he's a private investigator from LA, and everyone accepts it as reality. And so I think that's also worth paying attention to, those scenes in the novel where he effectively passes for a cop, that there are variations of law enforcement that with the right redirection, with the right badge or whatever, you can get someone to believe something that's not true.
Yeah, and
Um,
I believe he runs for sheriff when he's in Colorado at some point later on in the 70s, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think in Aspen, if I'm not
Yeah,
mistaken.
what you just said is great, dude, because it actually makes me rethink a kind of orthodoxy within the psychedelic world, which is something I've heard repeated by Timothy Leary, Terence McKenna, all the major psychedelic theorists, Ken Kesey, etc., which is that psychedelics pose such a threat to the system. LSD, mushrooms, all that kind of stuff that the hippies got into en masse in the 1960s because psychedelics acted as deconditioning agents to the values of capitalism, right? But what you're posing is actually the opposite. That in fact, and it's something that I've discovered certainly within my own psychedelic experiences, is that the psychedelic experience actually is quite compatible with capitalism and links into it. In fact, it feels like it's like just extra capitalism in some ways. And this connects to like Walter Benjamin and the Arcades project. The idea that like that he was writing about sort of the creation of these arcades, which were sort of like the first shopping malls in Europe, like these physical spaces that you walked through, and as you walked through, it was just like you were offered like just endless rounds of shit. And I think I've talked about on the podcast before that like that leads to shopping malls, that leads to Walt Disney and Disneyland, a sort of space that you walk through and it overwhelms the senses, and that's like that makes you like a prime like pure consumer, right? Is to be overwhelmed by this constant roll of shit, and that the scroll that we have on our phones is the arcade, right? It's a digital drug that delivers exactly what the arcade delivers, but in your hand. And you can just like scroll through as if you're walking through the mall, but instead you're sort of like just on your own. And there's something so important about that because it means that we're getting the like the 60s. You think put that in the context of like of Steve Jobs being like, I'm a hippie actually. And like I wanted to give people something that was like a legacy of the 60s with the iPhone. And it's sort of like, well, shit. They've given us the acid experience and it's social media. And that part of it is fucking crazy.
I think that that also brings some of the dialectical energy to like the Vegas Strip, New York City's Times Square, in that those spaces used to be the dopamine crawl, you know, but now that you're getting it through TikTok and Instagram,
Yeah, who cares
it,
about those places? Yeah.
except that people do, because the
Yeah.
irony is they now build those spaces for the selfie background,
Yeah.
and so those spaces become in this like it's like an arms race. They become digified in real life because they're being constantly recycled into that digital architecture. And so there's interesting questions there about tourism and Californication, et cetera.
Let me just throw one more thing in here, which is I'm thinking about the novel Big Sur by Kerouac. In that novel, he is torn because he wants to go and experience nature. He wants to get away from what he thinks of as the arcades, of the cities, the capitalism. He wants to go experience and really do psychedelics essentially, and sort of have that, Walden Pond experience, right? Which is another through line within the hippie thing, right? Which is that we're going to get back to nature. We're going to get away from the arcade. But what Kerouac finds when he goes to Big Sur is he's like bored out of his mind and he just wants to go back to San Francisco and like walk through the bars and like hang out in all the clubs and shit like that and experience the rush of modernity that is the city. That dichotomy is, I think, is important. That sort of like what is that longing for nature, but also that like inability to really be still in nature. These guys wanted so badly to be like Buddhist meditators on the mountain, but they couldn't escape the bar. They couldn't escape Vegas. Like look where and Hunter S. Thompson I think is a more honest Kerouac in some ways because when he gets loaded, he just wants to go to Vegas, right? And like be in the fucking circus, literally the circus. There's something important there. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. All I would say is, I don't know that it's ironic. I don't know that like this book takes place because he's there on assignment
Yeah.
for the motorcycle race and then for the narcotics conference. I don't know that he's there otherwise, so
Yeah.
part of his text here is his constant fascination and revulsion with what he finds in Vegas. And so I think let's bring out a couple little points that at least provide evidence for the claims we're making here. So this is later in the book, where he just comes straight at the point that we're making now. So this is like he's on his way out of Vegas, but he's kind of blundering around. But none of this makes any difference with a head full of mescaline. You just blunder around doing anything that seems to be right, and it usually is. Vegas is so full of natural freaks, people who are genuinely twisted, that drugs aren't really a problem, except for cops and the Skag Syndicate. Psychedelics are almost irrelevant in a town where you can wander into a casino any time of the day or night and witness the crucifixion of a gorilla on a flaming neon cross that suddenly turns into a pinwheel, spinning the beast around in circles above the crowded gambling action. So, like, again, I'm not even sure if that's a real detail or not. There's a hilarious gorilla scene that happens at the end of the story. But take that passage and connect it to a couple that occur in the first half of the book. This is kind of when they're kind of just getting into Vegas, and he's wandering around by himself. I think his attorney's like in the bathtub just tripping out, but they've separated. And he writes, now off the escalator and into the casino, big crowds still tight around the crap tables. Who are these people? These faces? Where do they come from? They look like caricatures of used car dealers from Dallas, but they're real. And sweet Jesus, there are a hell of a lot of them, still screaming around the Desert City crap tables at 4:30 on a Sunday morning, still humping the American dream, that vision of the big winner, somehow emerging from the last-minute pre-dawn chaos of a stale Vegas casino.
Mm.
I think that's a beautiful thing. It kind of sounds like he's tripping out around some of the MAGA crowd. Like even though this book's 71, all of the people he's mentioning here in my mind are Trump voters, and I just think that's like Trump is a freak character in Thompson's world.
He's a casino owner, dude.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
I guess that's totally. And
like when I go to Vegas, I sent you the picture. When I go to Vegas, the fucking giant Trump hotel is like looming over you there. I mean, it's hard to miss.
So a little bit later, like one chapter later, he's still in this kind of space and he's getting paranoid. And I think that, the paranoia might be something to tackle at some point too, because this is part of what makes this book so funny. And I've read it every few years for like 20 years, but I laugh so hard every time, especially with the scenes with Dr. Gonzo and, Thompson, who goes by Raoul Duke in this story. Their paranoia is so funny, but it's really interesting too. Anyway, this is one of these paranoid moments, and he's thinking to himself, and he's, this is one of the many moments where he's so worried about getting caught, and he imagines all these conversations with the cops. But anyway, this is what he's thinking. Sympathy? Not for me. No mercy for a criminal freak in Las Vegas. This place is like the army. The shark ethic prevails. Eat the wounded. In a closed society where everybody's guilty, the only crime is getting caught. In a world of thieves, the only final sin is stupidity. Now, one, that to me, I just can't help but think of the Trump cabinet and the Trump family.
Yeah.
But I don't want to make it all about that. But two, I'm really interested by how he links himself here to the people around him. So sometimes he's the exception, and many times he's not. And I think that speaks to some of that weirdness that we just described about the conflation between the counterculture and the mainstream culture, if you will. And it's also interesting how far do you want to press that phrase closed society? So that sentence again reads, in a closed society where everybody's guilty, the only crime is getting caught. It's really easy to pay attention to the end of that sentence where you're kind of thinking about something that sounds like it could have been written in Deadwood, sounds
Right.
like it could have been the Old West.
Yep.
But there's something else going on when he talks about a closed society, because remember, in 1971, closed society has Cold War connotations. And so this is really a phrase that we would associate listening to as a Vietnam era remark about communism, closed society, a society that's not free, to use your word from earlier. And so he's calling Vegas in the United States the closed society. And a part of your mind goes to McCarthy and the Red Scares. And a part of your mind goes to like the sort of overwhelming law enforcement presence that's prevalent, not just in this book because of the narcotics conference, and not just because of Thompson's run-in with the I guess maybe it was the California Highway Patrol, the CHP, not the Nevada Highway Patrol. But whatever it is, like it's not just that there are individual or groups of cops present. It's that he's that paranoia. He's always scared of getting caught because this closed society is closed because it's kind of vaguely a police state. And so part of his libertarian ethos that you described earlier, part of the reason it resonates so well beyond this paranoia that's coming out here, or real or imagined, is that he doesn't feel like he's operating in a free society. So, however much privilege we want to assign him for the reasons we speculated on earlier, there's something about this 1971 moment, which is the moment that Nixon declared the war on drugs,
Yep.
the
Yep.
moment that the '68 election kind of affirmed that darkness that came in the assassinations wave of King and RFK, et cetera. This idea that Hoover's FBI were the people that inherited the victories of the war that took place during the 60s. There's something to that. And I think, of all the things that we could do to link that to something, this idea of the closed society, I think for me, one of the primary analogies that I would link it to is that, like Baldwin, Thompson thinks a lot about Nazis. Like the Nazi figure
Yeah.
comes up a lot in the text. And it comes out most radically early on, where there's that line on page 46 where he says, "The circus is what the whole HEP world would be doing on Saturday night if the Nazis had won the war." That's a disturbing and ironic passage because, if he's saying that circus is where like the Nazis would have been congregating, well, what the fuck is the circus in fact doing in Las
Right.
Vegas? In other words, isn't he calling everyone in the circus a Nazi right now in the book? And he's there, and he's both in and out of it. And this is the last thing I'll say on this point. I'll throw it back to you. Later in the novel, when they're having trouble with Lucy, which is the girl that his attorney picked up on the airplane and gives her a bunch of drugs, and they're so scared that she's gonna turn them in and rat them out, and they put her up in the Americana Hotel. But there's this off moment, he says on page 115, where he's trying to get Lucy out of their room, and he says he had to have a serious talk with Lucy. "I felt like a Nazi, but it had to be done." Well, it's an interesting moment because obviously he doesn't mean it literally, but this idea that you could feel like a Nazi in a city that he claims is full of cops who he links to Nazism, that he is talking about circus in this way that's adjacent to a Nazi victory. I get that it's an exaggeration and that these are kind of comic moments, but like the Ralph Steadman drawings and like his whole mode of operation here, I think that the caricature is meant to be an analysis. In other words, like everything else we talk about in the show, there's a truth in the cartoon.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that if there is something else to the technology of psychedelic drugs, it's that it allows you to erase the veil and see something that others don't see. On the back of this book, there's a quote from Edward Abbey that says, "Thompson is really much more than a journalist, not a journalist at all, but one who sees, a seer." So, like, the idea of like seeing the Nazism in circus, which a lot of people would find ridiculous. They would just be like, "Oh, it's just a circus. It's just like a fun place to hang out." Whereas Thompson is sitting there freaking out and being like, "Holy fuck, this is Nazi shit." It makes sense because like that generation was haunted by World War II in a lot of ways from their parents, and Thompson's a little bit older. He's not born in 1945. He's born in the 30s, right? But either way, that the in the film, and I noticed this last night because I watched the movie again last night. I've seen that movie 1,000 times. But the movie starts, the very first image of the movie is of a helicopter, and I know exactly the newsreel footage that it is. It's a helicopter that's gassing students that are protesting the Vietnam War at UC Berkeley in 1969 or 1970. And it's a moment that is in documentaries about this era in which people say when it's kind of like that wave speech thing, the wave rolling back. It's the moment where people that were there at Berkeley, when they saw that the US government was going to use the same technology they were using to like kill people in Vietnam against them that were protesting, they realized like, oh fuck, like the bad guys won. Like we're not going to be able to fight this. We're the Viet Cong. That's what many of them say. Like we're going to get eradicated here. And so to start the movie with the images of the war and Vietnam and the repression of the movement, which is a really honestly chilling connection to today's moment with the Trump administration going directly after pro-Palestine activists in really like gross and what we might call, some of us might call, fascist ways. Like that sort of like Nazism that's there, it hangs over the entire work. And there's a bit that I appreciate that's in this copy of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas that I just got this week. That's the jacket copy for Fear and Loathing, in which Hunter S. Thompson wrote a little like intro where he's like, and he says like this was all made up. Like I went and really did this story on the motorcycle race, but like I ended up like imagining a lot of this stuff. And he's like, only a psycho could think that any of this actually happened. And I think that that's clarifying in some way because it's like a comic book. It is a hyperbolic sort of vision, and in that there's like sort of clarity. And he says, that the best, what is it? The quote from Faulkner. He says, this is Thompson saying, William Faulkner's idea that the best fiction is far more true than any kind of journalism, and the best journalists have always known this. I love that. And he's sort of like, I have to write this like really exaggerated, untrue story in order to get something to the truth. And here's a little bit of that Nazi connection from that introduction. He says, in a nation ruled by swine, all pigs are upward mobile, and the rest of us are fucked until we can put our acts together. Not necessarily to win, but mainly to keep from losing completely. We owe that to ourselves and our crippled self-image as something better than a nation of panicked sheep. But we owe it especially to our children, who will have to live with our loss and all its long-term consequences. I don't want my son asking me in 1984 why his friends are calling me a good German. So, like, once again, he's making that Nazi analogy and really seems to be obsessed with this notion that, like, we almost overcame the forces of evil in the 60s somehow. And I know that that's like a nostalgia trap in its own way, but it seems like it's an obsession for Thompson. Is that, you and I texted earlier this week about this being the 2025 being the 20th anniversary of Hunter S. Thompson's death by suicide in 2005, and we exchanged his suicide note. But I won't read it here. People can look at that online. But in his suicide note, he sort of like is striking the tone that the bad guys won, and it's all within the context of like the war on terror, 9/11, the Bush administration, and things like that. But it seems like he had kind of given up, and I think a lot of people actually criticize Hunter S. Thompson for being cynical and pessimistic in that way and feeling like it's all over. We had a chance to win in the 60s and we lost it. And it's sort of like that's its own kind of story, I guess. But there's something really tragic at the heart of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. And it feels like Thompson knows it, and sort of sat in that tragedy for the rest of his life.
It reminds me that when we talked about that, was it the John Wiener book,
Yeah.
Set the Night on Fire, a few years ago?
Yeah.
So many of the LAPD were actually like affiliated with like KKK or neo-Nazis or like white supremacist militias, that when you had those activist battles of the 60s, one of the things we argued, and I think we connected it back to that book about Hitler and Hollywood, was that like the battles against like actual fascist Nazis, not like metaphorical Nazis, was taking place throughout the war in the United States in different ways, but also taking place throughout the 50s and 60s in the kind of battles that we now associate with civil rights and the counterculture.
Yes.
That like the legacy of World War II wasn't just like the U.S. Soviet victories on either side of Berlin. It was then the way that some of those battles were then transposed back to the United States, where some of those fascist forces actually Nazi and also in their like Americana version, were already operating, sometimes explicitly sympathetic to Hitler, but in already operating in the ways that had inspired Hitler in the first place, like in Mein Kampf. And so that those battles were continuing, that kind of gives us a different read on some of the passages that you've just invoked here and the thematics that you've just invoked here, because it means that what was happening at the end here between 68 and 71, the kind of crash out that Thompson is meditating over in this book, wasn't just like a close to the chapter of like the 60s or the hippies or the counterculture. It was the kind of larger post-war battle that had been fought and had its real radical openings basically in the mid to late 50s and early 60s, especially with the victories of the civil rights movement, and then with some initial legitimate victories in the anti-war movement. And then something fell apart, and that moment of falling apart where you said that the students were now becoming the Viet Cong reminds me of Kent State, which, correct me if I'm wrong, is also 1971.
70. May 4th,
70, excuse me.
1970. Yep.
So almost there.
Yep.
And then also, one of the things we said is that this victory of sorts of like state repression, both in Vietnam and in the U.S., is what allowed for the rise of like the political economy of neoliberalism that we later associate with the elections of Reagan and Thatcher, in the early 80s, or late 70s, early 80s. So that's what we said in that Wiener show. But I think it's worth also thinking about it here too at this moment, not just in the context of Hunter's or Thompson's death, which I think if people are writing it off as him giving up, that's a really radical oversimplification, because his own health, I think, was probably the primary driver of what happened there.
He was in a lot of physical pain.
A lot of physical pain.
Yeah, needed hip surgery that wasn't working, and there was a lot going on there.
Yeah, his body was at the end of the line. Anyway, it's too complicated to go into here. But if you think about it in terms of these political thematics, it is also worth thinking about. And that's an amazing passage you read about, like, how do we bear the loss? I just want to touch on a couple things there that I think provoke us into this kind of final quarter of the show in terms of this analysis. One is just to say that the moment from the movie that you just remarked upon occurs at several points in the book where he's reading the newspaper. And I think the interjection of the news is interesting. I couldn't tell if these stories were real or not, but I guess that's besides the point. But on page 73, for example, he talks about like American GI overdose deaths that are going on in Vietnam, as a way to sort of meditate upon these other kind of grisly crimes that are both like crime blotter, local news type stuff, but also like anti-war, Vietnam War era stuff. And I thought part of the purpose of him interjecting those news stories, and part of what he explicitly says later is, the world is a dark place. And so a lot of the stuff that he himself is doing in terms of the drugs or his own criminal violations sort of pale in comparison to like the enormous crimes being committed by the state, and also these extremely violent crimes that are being committed in U.S. society, so that he explicitly links what's going on abroad to the fucked up thing that's going on at home.
Yeah.
But he's also tying it into Vegas itself. And again, for anyone interested in like sort of what is the purpose of Vegas here beyond what we've already said, this idea that whatever it is that we're digitizing, that whatever it is that is going on in that casino room that you spoke about earlier, that's not disconnected from some kind of desire to escape from blood on the streets, to quote Morrison and Peace Frog there for a second. And then I think once you factor that in, that we live in that world of successful assassinations. We live in this world where Hoover's FBI sort of ended up overpowering the good guys, if you will. It brings a new framework to the title of the book itself, which is produced in a sentence on page 85 that otherwise sounds like just the ramblings of a drug consciousness, because the sentence says, Jesus, bad waves of paranoia, madness, fear and loathing, intolerable vibrations in this place. Get out. flee. And then he kind of goes on from there. But that's where the Fear and Loathing title comes from. So the paranoia of the drug consciousness, of the drug trip, is also symptomatic of a larger political paranoia that's legitimate and valid. So, in
Mm.
the same way that we talked about that Vegas provides a kind of drug consciousness environment for people that otherwise aren't on drugs, like Vegas is psychedelic without the acid. In another sense, the kind of paranoia that's being described in the book that we're associating with drug use and drug experimentation and just, an acid trip and all the other things that he's on, this is also a symptom of the society itself, that whatever else is happening as a result of those losses, the effect is manifold. And one of the manifold effects of the collapse of the loss is like a paranoid temperament that, even though it's focalized through Thompson here, I think is like broadly symptomatic. And the reason I want to stress that is because the paranoid mind is the conspiratorial one. And when
Mm.
you look at
Hmm.
what happened in the 50 years after 1971, this we've talked about this in terms of the legacy of the JFK assassination,
Yeah.
but this is the Trump phenomenon. This is the idea that you don't know what's real. If you go back to when he was in the casino and he goes, "Who are all these people? They all look like Dallas used car dealers," and he goes, "But this was real." So the surrealness of the thing that you're apprehending is both a manifestation of a sick society, but it's also being filtered through not just like the framework of a drug consciousness, but it's actually being filtered through paranoid and conspiratorial minds and cultures that are going to continue and progress and evolve and mutate until we find ourselves in that doppelganger world that we've been describing all year.
Yeah, I love that. And I love the connection to crime and paranoia about crime and the kind of like notion that there is a savagery that's being unleashed and that it comes from the top too. It's not just like street crime and like he's constantly talking about like Jesus, they're gonna get her in a room and gangbang her and like they're literally he has like a kind of like vicious language about describing what's gonna happen to like women or children or the innocent. There's a lot of like bestiality in all of this. There's like reptiles fucking in the casino. Like it's all like there's something really insane and gross and dark happening. And it reminds me, if to my mind, one of the greatest crime writers in the 20th century is James Ellroy, who I just read his book, his memoir called My Dark Places, which I cannot recommend enough to Nostalgia Trap listeners. It's his memoir in which he kind of sort of he tries to come to terms with the rape and murder of his mother when he was 10 years old. And he tries to kind of figure that out and what it means to him. His history is of being in Los Angeles and coming of age during the 1960s. By the time he's a teenager in high school, the JFK assassination has happened, and that's he wrote a trilogy about the JFK assassination too, and sort of fictionalized all of it and did that sort of Thompson thing of trying to find the truth in fiction. But in either case, the thing that made me think about like the John Wiener book and the Set the Night on Fire and all the like Hitler in Los Angeles stuff is that what Elroy writes about is that when he was a teenager, he was an angry dude, and he used the sort of language of Nazism to express his anger and his resentment at like white liberals and stuff like that. And he says he went to a number of different storefronts in Los Angeles that were selling Nazi memorabilia that were basically just like Nazi stores in LA in the early 60s. And most of the material was reactionary material towards Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement. So he said he would buy Nazi armbands and wear them to school. He went to school with mostly Jewish kids. And so he did this to provoke them. He was a troll, and he was self-consciously a troll. And he was, now he's, writing this book from the position of being a guy in his 70s. He's like smart enough to understand what the psychology was. He was like a traumatized kid who was sort of trying to figure his way out, and his way out was by putting on this mean persona. But yeah, he bought Nazi armbands. He said there were books of tickets that were tickets back to Africa that you could hand out to black people on the street in LA, and just like really, really ugly shit that was being sold in storefronts in Los Angeles during this era. And it brings to mind this whole thing about like, I don't know, the connections between the JFK assassination and the darkness of that overhanging this era, and that the Nazism does, whether it's explicit or not, the Nazism, the reactionary racism, it gives a kind of language to a particular psychology, a traumatized psychology, a paranoid psychology. It gives, and it just made sense to me. And it feels like Thompson is cutting into that material too.
Those are stupendous points. I love it. And, here, with those stakes, I think it's important to then reread those like famous passages in the text as we conclude here,
Yeah.
because they themselves are concluding points.
Oh,
In
let
the
me do
text.
the wave speech then.
Yeah, well, let me throw out the predecessor to the wave speech then,
Okay, cool.
and then I have a connection for you there afterward. But early in the book, when he's looking through his notebooks, he's wondering about what he was writing about people like Joe Frazier and like this fight in Seattle. And he thinks that's what ended the 60s. And so there's a couple, this is like a theme in the book, beginning, middle, end. And this early scene says, a very painful experience in every way, a proper end to the 60s. Timothy Leary, a prisoner of Eldridge Cleaver in Algeria. Bob Dylan clipping coupons in Greenwich Village. Both Kennedys murdered by mutants. Owlsley folding napkins on Terminal Island. And finally, Cassius Ali belted incredibly off his pedestal by a human hamburger, a man on the verge of death. Joe Frazier, like Nixon, had finally prevailed for reasons that people like me refuse to understand, at least not out loud. And then he says that was the burned out era. That last sentence is why I'm reading it, because of what you just said about the author that you were describing as his youth in the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
And it's this idea that Frazier prevailed for reasons that people like me refuse to understand, at least not out loud. That sets up a mystery. And part of that mystery it sets up is what you're about to read.
Yeah.
But there's
Yeah.
another part to the mystery there, which is what psychic core is there to that fascist impulse? Like, where does it come from? Because it provides an answer that goes beyond that the 60s failed because it was repressed, or the 60s failed because the utopian vision wasn't good enough. It posits that lizard core, that like there's like a deep problem here. All the people he mentions are men. There's this deep core to masculinity itself that seems to be something that you can't surgically remove, that is at least provoking us as we think about that thing you're about to read here, which is not to say that what I'm saying overwhelms that interpretation, but I just want it to be remembered as we contemplate like the full metaphor that we're about to get.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, you canth overcome the lizard brain.
Yeah, there's something else back there. In other
Yeah.
words, that's almost beyond partisanship.
Okay, I want to read the what is often referred to as the wave speech in several different pieces of writing, and I think in documentaries and interviews. Thompson sort of said that this was like the most famous passage he'd ever written. People love it for whatever reason. I love it too. It resonates. It has, I mean, you even love it. You kind of love it almost just for the pure literary qualities of it. It's so well written. But it also sort of captures, I think, what we wanted to get at today, which is this sort of like particular nostalgia trap about what was gained and what was lost in the 60s. So here's the wave speech. Strange memories on this nervous night in Las Vegas. 5 years later, six, it seems like a lifetime, or at least a main era, the kind of peak that never comes again. San Francisco in the middle 60s was a very special time and place to be a part of. Maybe it meant something, maybe not in the long run, but no explanation, no mix of words or music or memories can touch that sense of knowing that you were there and alive in that corner of time and the world, whatever it meant. History is hard to know because of all the hired bullshit, but even without being sure of history, it seems entirely reasonable to think that every now and then, the energy of a whole generation comes to a head in a long, fine flash, for reasons that nobody really understands at the time, and which never explain, in retrospect, what actually happened. My central memory of that time seems to hang on 1 or 5 or maybe 40 nights, or very early mornings, when I left the Fillmore half crazy and instead of going home, aimed the big 650 Lightning across the Bay Bridge at 100 miles an hour, wearing LL Bean shorts and a Butte sheepherder's jacket, booming through the Treasure Island Tunnel at the lights of Oakland and Berkeley and Richmond, not quite sure which turnoff to take when I got to the other end, always stalling at the toll gate, too twisted to find neutral while I fumbled for change, but being absolutely certain that no matter which way I went, I would come to a place where people were just as high and wild as I was. No doubt at all about that. There was madness in any direction, at any hour. If not across the bay, then up the Golden Gate or down 101 to Los Altos or La Honda. You could strike sparks anywhere. There was a fantastic universal sense that whatever we were doing was right, that we were winning. And that, I think, was the handle. That sense of inevitable victory over the forces of old and evil. Not in any mean or military sense. We didn't need that. Our energy would simply prevail. There was no point in fighting, on our side or theirs. We had all the momentum. We were riding the crest of a high and beautiful wave. So now, less than 5 years later, you can go up on a steep hill in Las Vegas and look west. And with the right kind of eyes, you can almost see the high water mark, that place where the wave finally broke and rolled back. So that is the key passage from Fear and Loathing, although I think you and I have identified some other key passages, Justin. But that idea, it's funny because it's very easy to be like, well, what a nostalgia trap. This is kind of a boomer saying, like, talking about his party days and how cool it all was. But when I read it, I feel the tragedy of it. I can almost believe it. I can almost believe his, like, I don't know, the sort of good and evil thing that he's setting up there. It feels real, and it feels like, for whatever reason, that was his historical moment. And he does seem to acknowledge, I could be wrong about all of this. I could be just sort of like making it up. Who knows how history works? But that's part of what I appreciate about Thompson always is his self-doubt even. It's part of his appeal.
What's interesting is that the tone is one of an elegy, and because the words work, because the sentences work, the form and content blend together. And part of the reason it's such a powerful passage, just from a writing perspective, is because the form actually is able to achieve what the content is also supposed to be about.
Yeah.
So in other words, it produces the feeling that he's trying to describe. And that's a difficult aesthetic feat. And so I think that is notable and worthy. And the reason I think that, beyond like a formalistic evaluation, is because it lends, like, when that experience happens in art, film, music, writing, it tends to register with us as true. Now, that could be deception. You know what I mean? Like that there's nothing scientific behind that, but we feel it to be true. And I think that one of the things that I think people must adore about that passage, especially the people that were there, is that when the elegy works, and this is true when we speak at memorials, when the elegy works, we provide value to the loss. And when you provide value to the loss, you certify that the person or the event or that time was valuable. In other words, like, just because it was beaten doesn't mean it was worthless.
Yeah.
And the people who beat it, they beat it with a sense that they were trying to degrade it. They were trying to destroy it. They were so full of violence in their words. So in other words, like, the things that Hoover and others believed about this generation was that these people were scum, and they were savages, they were animals, and that they were worthless. So that when you have
giving dignity to something that died a gruesome death, and rescuing it from just the gruesome death itself, if that makes sense.
It does. And then that's what people need. They need to know things like that. I think the other reason why the passage resonates is because even though it's about some of the hippie stuff and not the civil rights stuff, which is really, really, really important and interesting. And that's why I think I would want to teach this alongside Baldwin's No Name in the Street.
Yes.
Is because the kinds of things that he's saying are very, like, in the way what you just read, they're very West Coast. They're very San Francisco. And in some ways, it's the white side of the counterculture and not the black militant or the black power side of the movement, that is fucking key as shit and worth like interrogating, but
Well, I
not
would I
here,
would think if
not today.
yeah, if Thompson were here, he would see racism as and he invokes racism a lot in deeply ironic ways, but he would see racism as just further evidence of the lizard brain, right?
Right.
It's another part of that. And in that sense he's sort of defeatist about it in the sense that he's like that's always going to be there.
Yeah, and then I think what's implied, in other words, this is a white point of view, and that's not a reason to discard it. It's an observation that needs to texture its interpretation, but the thing that works then, the thing that works is the fact that on a good day, the tone that he's striking, that elegy, is also true for the civil rights movement. In other
Yeah.
words, there were sacrifices made, and we all know that those sacrifices were worth it. And we also know that the people active in the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement, they were called many of the same names as the people that we're just describing, and bringing dignity to the people who were called communists, including King and others, is an important part about restoring memory. And then therefore, what is the role of the book? Well, in a world where the Hoovers won and where the Trumps became ascendant, in that world, a book like this matters because it preserves the countercultural, or what, even in a Chomskyan phrase, like the libertarian socialist impulse. It preserves that feeling and captures it, and maybe the book is able to do something else. I also, if you take that wave passage, and just as an aside, this is an English professor thing, and you set the rhythm of the sentences and also the imagery back into that American dream thing that the book's trying to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
One, it's a weird way to politicize the utopia dystopia qualities of the American dream itself, meaning it's not just a material fantasy, maybe it was a political one that became a political nightmare. But two, why don't you reread that language against The Great Gatsby, which is the main text of the American dream, like at the K through 12 level at least. But listen to these passages at the end of the Gatsby written by Fitzgerald, and ask yourself who Thompson had in mind when he was writing that passage.
Yeah.
Listen to how he channels this. Okay, this is the last three paragraphs of The Great Gatsby.
Oh, great. I was going to say I hope you have it.
And as I sat there, brooding on the old unknown world, I thought of Gatsby's wonder when he first picked out the green light at the end of Daisy's dock. He had come a long way to this blue lawn, and his dream must have seemed so close that he could hardly fail to grasp it. He did not know that it was already behind him, somewhere back in the vast obscurity beyond the city, where the dark fields of the Republic rolled on under the night. Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch our arms farther, and one fine morning, and so we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past.
Wow. Never
Bro,
noticed that before, dude. That is
it's
amazing.
fucking Gatsby, bro.
Yeah.
It's fucking Fitzgerald.
It is. And it reminds me that Kerouac at some point when he was training himself to be a writer, he would type out Great Gatsby, like just to get it under his fingers, just to feel like what it was like to write sentences like that. So it makes total sense, that connection. That's great. Yeah.
Okay, I know we have to go. I have one more, like just little. This is my last thing. Because for students of the text, the thing that connects that wave passage, which is the famous one, to the one I read before, which was, I think, was page 23. There's another one on 178, 179, and I'm not going to get too far into it, but I think it captures this weird spirituality of Thompson, which also cathects to the Beat Generation in various ways that we've described, and cathects to Morrison, and kind of does some other nostalgia trap work that we don't have time to discuss here, but it's worth just putting on the table for next time. And this is on 178. And he's thinking through the same shit about now it's the Nixon era. The 60s are out of style. And he says, we're on a survival trip now. And then he says, not that they didn't deserve it. No doubt they all got what was coming to them. All those pathetically eager acid freaks who thought they could buy peace and understanding for $3 a hit. But Their loss and failure is ours too. What Leary took down with him was the central illusion of a whole lifestyle he helped to create. A generation of permanent cripples, failed seekers who never understood the essential old mystic fallacy of the acid culture, the desperate assumption that somebody, or at least some force, is tending that light at the end of the tunnel. One, back to Gatsby. Two, that passage is straight from fucking Fight Club. If you listen to the thing that Tyler Durden says,
Yeah.
it sounds like that. And then three, it's that wave metaphor happening once again, but he adds something to it because now he says the loss isn't just like a politics. He says the loss is this loss of the illusion. But to me, when I read it, when you get to that last line, the desperate assumption that somebody, or at least some force, is tending that light at the end of the tunnel. Earlier in the book, he talks openly about what he calls the great magnet. And the great magnet is the thing that's keeping him safe. Later, he talks about his own degenerate Christianity. So when you get to this passage about the force that's tending the light at the end of the tunnel, he doesn't fully negate it throughout the book. In other words, the period, the era is over. But Thompson implies here and elsewhere, there's a resonation, there's a resonance, excuse me. There's a resonance with his resignation that there is a larger power. You know, I don't know if it's deistic. I don't know where, but there's a larger power and that something is still possible. There's still a reason to hope. There's still something that's kind of drawing the good ones together. There's still a camaraderie, a solidarity. There's something there that's going to keep pulling us towards the light. It's not without sacrifice. It's not without doom. It's not without paranoia. It's not without madness, and it's not without loss or anything else. It's not without grief, but that there is still something there for us to look to. And the fact is, this book was written in 1971. It's a product of the Nixon survivalist era. Something great is coming out of that era at the same moment that he's lamenting the end of one.
Yeah.
So the book itself is a sign of the light.
Yeah.
And the book itself, it wasn't a product of the 60s. It was a product of 1971. It's a product of the 1970s. There's still reason to hope. The book is evidence of that.
I love that reading, dude. And it sort of makes me think that the next thing we should talk about, or at least something that I know we're going to get to eventually on this show, is Cormac McCarthy and No Country for Old Men, because I'm thinking about that dream that Tommy Lee Jones has at the end of that movie, talking about the light and the fire that he sees his father carrying in a dream on the horse, an image that just is so evocative, and I know hits us both really hard on an emotional level, but also in this sort of like, I don't know, this kind of political and social and historical level too. And it feels like Hunter S. Thompson's Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas connects to all of that. And No Country for Old Men is also just a story about crime and darkness and all of this stuff. So maybe we'll get to that. But thank you, everyone. Thank you, Justin. Always great talking with you. I love Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, and it feels like I would describe Hunter S. Thompson's writing in a lot of ways as close to the psychedelic experience in a way for me, in the sense that you can forget about it when you're not having it, but when you go back to it, you go, oh shit. Like you kind of pick up right where you left off, and you feel like, I forgot. This is so important to me. This is so vital. This is me. And when I was reading, particularly, and not just watching the movie, but reading his text especially, I have that feeling of like, oh, like this guy really nailed something. Like he really captured something, and it speaks to my own sort of view of things. And I know that is not, I'm not alone in that he resonates with a lot of people. So thank you, Justin. We'll talk to you again soon.
All right. Thank you.